Hey, for everybody online, we're doing roll call. Sorry, we had you muted. So Dr. Hagerman.
Here.
Member Jefferson?
Here.
Member Kaufman?
Here. Here.
Dr. Moy?
It's Moigs, but here.
Member Pearson?
Here.
Member Murphy?
Here.
Dr. Spencer?
Here.
Member Taylor?
Here.
Dr. Testa?
Here.
And Member Tiffany?
Here.
Perfect. So we have a quorum, and we'll talk about the need for a quorum in a bit when we talk about open meeting law. So the first item on the agenda, 1A, is really just a sort of welcome and a brief overview of the subcommittee since this is the first meeting. Again, I want to welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. Per R7-2-201, the board may form an ad hoc subcommittee at any time to study any issue or issues and to have that subcommittee make formal recommendations to the board. The board does have some permanent subcommittees. There's a certification advisory committee, A through F advisory committee, but periodically the board will form subcommittees like this to delve into specific issues. And so I'm excited. This is actually the first one in a bit. I think the last one was the ad hoc K-3 early literacy committee that wrapped up a couple years ago. The board voted in October to create the subcommittee and then voted in December. So just last Monday to approve the roster. It's why there was a more truncated timeline between the agenda being released and the meeting. In future meetings, the agenda will be released at least 12 days before the meeting, but the vote had to happen before we could do that this time. In speaking of the roster, board staff gathered recommendations from key stakeholders across the state for members of the subcommittee, reached out to all of you for applications for consideration. And this recommended roster represents the goal to create a subcommittee of technical experts that represent a multitude of areas of expertise and perspectives from Arizona's special education landscape. Again, we're so thankful that you're all here. I can't wait to learn from each of you. The subcommittee will be co-facilitated by me and by Rory Fitzpatrick, who is the director of the National Center for Systemic Improvement. Rory is with us virtually today, but will be with us in person for most of the meetings. She's actually, I believe, out of Nevada. And so we're very, 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 very thankful to have Rory with us and to have her expertise and leadership as well. So just to go over a few logistics for the meeting, kind of for you folks, but also for those who are watching at home. Meetings will be held monthly or twice monthly as needed. They will always be from 9 to noon so that there's consistency in your calendars. They'll always be in this building. I wish I could say they will always be in this room, but we share this room with the charter board and some other folks. So there will be a couple of meetings that will be in this building in another room, and we'll make sure to give you some specifics on that when we get to that point. Meetings are open to the public, so we can have members of the public join us either in person or online. The meetings are live streamed on the board's YouTube channel, and they're archived on the board's YouTube channel. So if for any reason you have some stakeholders who are interested and couldn't attend, they can always go back and watch the meetings, and they're archived for years, so they'll be there for a while. Because this is a subcommittee of the board, it is subject to open meeting law. A quorum of members is required in order to hold a meeting, and a quorum is 8 members. So that's it for item 1A, just some logistics. There'll be more sort of towards the end of the meeting. But actually, any quick questions before we move on? Okay, hearing none, we'll go to item 1B. And this will be a brief introduction of you all, both to each other and to, again, the larger public. Again, it's my firm belief that this is a group of powerhouse folks. I have learned a lot about all of you and in our communications and in getting recommendations from the field, and I'm just so excited to have you here. And you've all dedicated your lives to making the world better for kiddos, and get people like that in a room together, and there's really nothing that can't be done. So very excited to have you here. For introductions, what I'll ask is it's a larger committee, so we'll keep them pretty brief. So you'll give your name, your organization, and then very brief high-level overview of your experience with special education evaluation. So 1 or 2 sentences. I know that's hard. Some of you have decades of experience, but we'll get to know each other better as time goes on. So I will model. I'm Sean Ross. I'm the executive director of the Arizona State Board of Education, and I was a classroom teacher and site leader for 15 years prior to joining the state, and so have extensive experience working with students with disabilities and being part of CSTs and IEP teams. But my area of focus was not in evaluation. So it's one of the reasons we have Rory joining us as co-facilitator to make sure to get her expertise. So actually, Rory, speaking of that, let's go to her next, and then we'll go to committee members. So Rory, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, quick sound check. Can you hear me just fine?
We can.
Excellent. Thanks for the affirmative nod, Dr. Hickman. So I'm Rory Fitzpatrick. I'm a senior managing director at West Ed. I'm here with a couple of hats on today on behalf of the Region 15 Comprehensive Center. You'll hear a little bit more about them in a minute, as well as the National Center for Systemic Improvement. These are both federally funded technical assistance centers by the U.S. Department of Education that ensure that state education agencies and the boards with whom they work have access to free supports to help them improve outcomes. My work is all about improving outcomes for kids with disabilities. I bring to this space decades of experience, as Sean was alluding to, for many of us. Probably most relevant to this committee in particular is having served as assistant director and state director for special education for the state of Nevada for many years, then as the chief deputy superintendent, and for a little stint, the interim state superintendent. So lots of experience setting policy, working with boards, and then partnering with school districts to help them implement those policies and procedures through their practices. Thanks.
Thanks, Rory. So actually, I'm just going to take members alphabetically. I know that isn't quite how we sat you, but I think it's the simplest way for me to make sure I don't miss anybody. So Colette Chapman, do you want to go first?
Yes, I work at the Arizona Department of Education as an associate superintendent, and one of the sections I oversee is exceptional student services. I served as the state director of special education 2007 to 2011. And prior to that, I was a special education complaint investigator, due process coordinator, and I don't know, this is my 3rd time back at the Department of Education, and I'm really excited to be here.
Thanks, Colette. Dr. Marcia Spencer, do you want to go next?
Yes, my name is Marcia Spencer, and I am a school psychologist. And as far as special education evaluations, we're often the ones that are conducting the evaluations. And then I also teach for the University of Arizona. So I've been teaching graduate students how to conduct psychoeducational assessments for about 12 years now. So I spend a lot of time thinking about this, teaching this, and refining this process in my daily work. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And for those of you who suddenly went, wait, that's not alphabetical at all. I realized I was going to go alphabetical, and then I went off the list in front of me, and it's alphabetized by role. So we're just going to go with that. So Chris, Tiffany, do you mind going next?
Good morning. My name is Christopher Tiffany. I'm the executive director at Raising Special Kids, and I'm a former classroom teacher. Before I came to Raising Special Kids, we are Arizona's Parent Training and Information Center, so we are accountable to the Office of Special Education Programs to ensure that parents have information, training, and support to meet their needs. What that means is we help them understand rights and responsibilities, and the evaluation component, assessment, eligibility is all part of that. And I've been working in the field for about, if you include my teaching, about 15 or 16 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Testa?
Hello, everyone. My name is Erin Testa. I am a licensed psychologist and certified school psychologist in Arizona. My predoctoral training is all in school psychology, where I did complete special education evaluations in various school districts. I have currently been employed at Gentry Pediatric Behavioral Services, which is a private practice for the last almost 10 years, where I complete private evaluations as well as independent educational evaluations for students.
Thank you. And then Dr. I said your name incorrectly before. I said Moy, but it's
It's Moix. It's
Moix.
phonetic.
Oh, add the X. Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. So Dr. Moix, please.
It used to be French, but we moved to Arkansas, so it's Moix now. I'm Matthew Moix. I am the coordinator of psychological services for Gilbert Public Schools. Also the president of the Arizona Association of School Psychologists. This is my 24th year in public education. I was a school psychologist in various levels, elementary, junior, or elementary and high school, preschool, for 18 years, and have been a coordinator of psychological services, supervising the school psychologists in Gilbert for the last 6 years.
Thank you. David Jefferson.
My name is David Jefferson. I'm the founder of Parent Support Arizona. We're a statewide advocacy organization. I also serve as the board chair for the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates, a national organization with 3,300 members. I teach other advocates how to understand the implications of psychoeducational evaluations, and I attend probably 300 IEP meetings a year, and a fair share of those are also evaluation meetings.
Thank you. Richard Murphy.
My name is Richard Murphy. I'm at the law office of Richard Murphy, and I represent parents and students in disputes with school districts. I've been doing this for about 12 years. I've looked at hundreds of evaluations and helped parents navigate that process. Thank you.
Thank you. Heather Pearson.
I'm Heather Pearson. I'm an attorney at Udall-Shumway. I represent school districts and charter schools, only doing special education, and I am also a parent of a child with a disability. So I do this at work and I also do this at home. And I was a teacher and I taught students with behavior disorders before I went to law school.
Thank you. Amanda Glass.
Hi, I'm Amanda Glass. I'm an attorney at the Arizona Center for Disability Law. We are the protection and advocacy agency for the state. I, prior to going to law school, was a special education teacher in California for a few years, have a master's in special ed, and I've been at the center for about 5 years doing education work, mostly special education work.
Thank you. Clark Crace.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Clark Crace. I currently serve as the president of Arizona Autism Charter Schools. I've been working in the field of special education for just about 20 years now, maybe 21, in a bunch of different states. The last 8 years here in Arizona. Most of my experience has either been as a classroom teacher or a director of special education in school districts.
Thank you. Tina Kaufman.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Tina. I'm a director in the Valley for a preschool through 8th district, and I have been a director for 10 years. Prior to that, I was a high school coordinator as well as a special education teacher. I am the current president for AZ Case, and I am also a grandparent of a child with disability.
Thank you. Charlotte Taylor.
Hi, good morning. I'm Charlotte Taylor. I'm the behavioral health coordinator for the Cochise County School Superintendent's Office. In my past life, I was a teacher for many years and then an administrator and a special ed director for an IGA in our little county. And then I went to work for Easter Seals Blake Foundation and helped with AZIP for many years. And then my most recent job now, I'm helping coordinate our consortium there. And I'm also a parent of a child with special needs.
And just for folks who may not know, AZIP is a Arizona Early Intervention Program. Up next, Member Clark.
I'm trying not to smile too big. I'm so grateful that you guys are all here. I'm so excited about this committee and the good work that we're going to do. I am Member Clark. I am most importantly a parent. I have 5 children, had the pleasure of going through the AZIP process, the school district evaluation process, all the things. Presently, I'm the founder of Love Your School. That's a nonprofit that helps families navigate their school choice options. And a big part of that is, of course, navigating special education evaluations and looking for the school that's best for them. Been on the board a little over a year and a half now. And yeah, thanks for being here.
Thank you. Dr. Hagerman.
Yeah, my name's Scott Hagerman. I am the superintendent of the Tanque Verde School District and on the state board for like the last year and a half, like Jenny. I started off my career as a board certified music therapist and then worked as a special educator, special ed administrator, and an elementary principal before coming to Tanque Verde. I'm glad to be here. Thank you guys.
Thank you. And last but not least, Member Kravickas.
Good morning. I'm Carla Phillips Kravickas, a state board member for about the same long time. And I just have to say, I've been just sitting here watching her smile the whole time and trying not to laugh. But thank you also for being here and giving of your time. I am the CEO and president of Inclusive Strategies, where our mission is to make sure that students with disabilities are included in all policies, programs, and initiatives. And I am the mother of 2 children with IEPs.
All right. Thanks, everybody. And I don't believe I missed anybody. We also have amazing board staff here today to help support. We have Shannon Etz, who is our project director. And then we have Melissa Becerra, who's our office manager. They're running tech and taking minutes and doing all of that great stuff. And then I'll introduce Lou Caputo in just a bit from the Attorney General's office. So we're going to move next to item 1C, which is an election of chair or vice chair for the Special Education Evaluation Subcommittee. All subcommittees of the board elect a chair and vice chair to lead the meetings, help plan agendas, and help facilitate discussions. We're going to jump pretty quickly into the water here. Do I have any nominations for the chair of the Special Education Evaluation Subcommittee? What I'll do is I'll take any nominations from you all. If there seems to be consensus, we'll go to a motion, a second, and then we would do a vote. So just like we would on any board item. So this is open up to any subcommittee members who'd like to volunteer a name.
I'd like to nominate Dr. Scott Hagerman for chair.
Okay, we have a nomination of Dr. Hagerman. Any other names for consideration? Okay, so if I could have one of the members propose a motion to nominate Dr. Hagerman.
I move that we elect Dr. Hagerman as the chair of the Special Education Evaluation Subcommittee.
So that was Member Clark. Is there a second?
Second.
Member Kravickas, second. So we will then go to a vote. All in favor of electing Dr. Scott Hagerman as the chair of the Special Education Evaluation Subcommittee, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Congratulations, Dr. Hagerman. You are the chair of the Special Education Evaluation Subcommittee. So we will then move next to electing a vice chair. So any members may put forward a name for vice chair.
I would like to nominate Jenny Clark.
So we have a nomination for Member Clark for vice chair. Any other names for consideration? So will I have may I please have a member propose a motion for Member Clark to be the vice chair?
I propose a motion that member Jenny Clark be the vice chair.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Member Kravickas. So we will put this to a vote. So all members in favor of electing Jenny Clark as the vice chair of the Special Education Evaluation Subcommittee, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, Member Clark, you are the vice chair of the Special Education Subcommittee. So actually, we are going to take a 5-minute break here so I can talk to the chair and vice chair as they will now take over the meetings. And so we'll shut down for about 5 minutes of live stream, and then we'll come right back. So this is a good time if you need a restroom break or to stand and stretch your legs after, I guess, 20 minutes of talking. you so much, everybody. That was just gave us a chance to talk to the chair and vice chair. And for each meeting, we create a kind of annotated script for them to guide them through. And so actually Dr. Hagerman and Member Clark both felt to be more appropriate for Member Clark to lead this meeting since he's virtual. So Member Clark, I'll turn it over to you for item 1D, please.
Thank you, Director Ross. Now we're going to move to item 1D. Director Ross.
So thank you, Vice Chair Clark. As is the case with all board meetings, the Special Education Evaluation Subcommittee meetings will follow open meeting law. With us today to provide a brief high-level overview of open meeting law is Lou Caputo. He's the Education Chief Counsel from the Arizona Attorney General's Office and works with us very closely on board meetings and board issues. And we'll bring up Lou's presentation in just a sec here. Thanks, Lou.
Good morning. Everybody hear me? All right. So high level on Arizona's open meeting law. We can go to the next slide if we can, please. Just get right into it. There's going to be more words on each slide than I will probably mention sometimes. So I'm not going to read it verbatim. But getting to public policy. Arizona's open meeting law is there for the public to know what its government is up to, combined with the public records law. The open meeting law allows the public to see what various boards, committees, agencies, subcommittees are up to. And in that paragraph up there, which is a direct cite from statute, I'll bring you to about halfway down. And we'll talk about this a little bit more. After the part that says conducted openly, I'll bring you down to that third line talking about when notices and agendas are provided for such meetings going into that which contain such information as reasonably necessary. Reasonably necessary for notices and agendas are to give the public a heads up of what you're going to be doing. And it doesn't have to be completely detailed, but the legislature put as reasonably necessary so you can at least let them know what's happening and then discuss more at the meetings. Next slide, please. So the open meeting law applies to legislature, state boards, committees. It also, as I said, applies to subcommittees and advisory committees. The definition of the advisory committee is right there, but just so you know, and as Sean's already said, the open meeting law applies to this advisory committee. So just keep that in mind. Next slide, please. Notice. Notice is important. Notice is important for the public, so they have a way to know what's coming up for the subcommittee, to be able to participate if they would like, and to be able to listen in if they would like. And the top part there, you can read it for yourself, but that second line again, all persons so desiring shall be permitted to attend, right? So they can come, they can listen, they can even participate if there is going to be comment allowed. So you'll see at the bottom, there has to be advance notice of meetings of at least 24 hours, excluding generally weekends and holidays, et cetera. And so again, therefore the public to have a good chance, reasonable chance to participate and or watch. Next slide, please. The definition there for meetings is at the top, but this is where I'll stress that a meeting isn't just what we're doing today. So a meeting can, and this is where I think anymore a lot of people would need to pay a bit more attention. So that's my caution. Meetings can take place here. They can also take place in a different way. So if you looked at that second part where you have a quorum of members, that's when you have enough of you, and it can start with just one of you, and then it can make its way. A conversation can make its way to the next person and the next person, or it can be virtual by email. And if you go down on that slide, that's how easily a meeting can happen. And often what we see is people don't actually mean for it to happen, but then it just does for lack of a better way of saying it. So again, that one-way electronic communication, it can be what's called a serial communication. It makes its way to various members, and by the time it's there, members of the committee or whatever public body it is have been talking about a subject, and then that can turn in itself into a meeting, or at least there can be an accusation that it's a meeting. And it can be one to another, but then an exchange of ideas or an exchange of emails can also constitute a meeting in specific circumstances. The gist, right, it doesn't prohibit communication. It doesn't prohibit normal communication, but when you're talking about a specific item that's going to be on your agenda or that could be related to you, that could actually constitute a meeting, or it could give someone the idea that it should constitute a meeting, and that's when people often bring it up. Next slide, please. So we've went over a few of the ways a meeting can occur. So obviously, you don't have to be in the same spot, especially with virtual meetings and communications being so prevalent. When you're not in the same spot, it can still happen. Zoom counts, and that can even happen in settings that may be a bit innocuous, right? You can be in a social setting, and it can involve conversations that don't start out that way. And it can involve, as I said, one of you, it can involve more of you. But the point is that when there's a conversation and it involves enough of you and it involves some subject reasonably related to what you're doing, that's where the issue started, and that can be a meeting, and the public would have a right to know about it and to be able to participate. That middle part, the middle section, as I said, it's not a complete prohibition on talking with one another. It's not a complete prohibition on giving your opinion, things that are important to you. These are very important topics that you're talking about. And these topics are not just discussed here. So, but keep in mind that that last part, right? Though there's two criteria, right? So the opinions and discussions are okay, right? Where they are not principally directed at or directly given to another member. And then there's no concerted plan, as it says under the statute, to engage in talking about it or to take a legal action. So at the bottom, my bolded type words, you'll see that on some of the slides. I do it. So when I represent the State Board of Education. So when I present this topic, I try to also give some best practices just to keep things in mind. That bolded one at the bottom, just be mindful whether you're in a meeting or you're out and about of topics that could require collective action or illegal action by you. And in my opinion, do the best that you can. Just friendly advice. Do the best you can to limit your discussions over email, text messaging, and in social situations, and really to what is necessary, and certainly not what you're going to be voting on or really discussing in substance here. And that should and that should help. And just be mindful that your emails, your text messages, letters can at least be argued to be public records, depending on what the topic is that you're talking about. Next slide, please. So that's a copy of the board's agenda, just as an example. And this has to be out. There's got to be notice, and there has to be an agenda about what you're doing. And it's there, not just to remind yourselves what you're going to be talking about today, but really to tell the public what you're going to be talking about and what you may act on. When we went back to that second slide, I reiterated that point again. The agendas have to contain information that is reasonably necessary to inform the public. And it doesn't have to be precise. It doesn't have to include every word. It doesn't have to include everything you want in there. It just has to be reasonably necessary so the public knows what's going to be happening. And that bottom part, again, that's listing of the specific matters to be discussed. And that way they can participate or at least listen in, as it is their right to do. Next slide, please. If you need to take something out of order, if you need to take an agenda item out of order, you can do that. The only problems come when somebody thinks that it's done to prohibit them from participating or listening. It's generally not a problem. And sometimes different agenda items, as we know, need to be moved. And so that's not a problem, but I do mention it in there as just to keep in mind as the meetings go on. Best practice is to post the agenda along with the notice of the meeting. And I do recommend just giving the public a little bit more information rather than less. If it's going to be voting on rather than discussion, or if there's something about the particular agenda item that you think might be helpful for the public to understand what you're doing, then I would include it. And I suggest for each one of you to, this may sound very rudimentary, but I do recommend reviewing the agenda that you have before you come to the meeting. And I'm sure you all know what's on there. Just sometimes when things change, just to remind yourselves to put it on the best foot moving forward, just review the agenda item in advance and then stick to the items on the agenda. Sometimes topics may relate to what you're talking about, but if they have not been placed on the agenda, if the public does not know what that they are coming, they will not have that ability to come listen. They will not have the ability to come participate if they're able. So stick to the items on the agenda. Items can always be moved or brought up again once they're properly on an agenda and given notice at future meetings. Next slide, please. Sean, we'll skip executive session.
Yeah, maybe just say what it is.
Sure. In open meeting law, when certain matters, and there's a group of them on that slide, when certain matters need to be discussed confidentially, and there's a few of them, the public body can call an executive session. So there's a few of them up there. I get brought in for legal advice. And that's really to keep things confidential. But at most, I mean, the general rule for open meeting law is you open it to the public. There are some matters, such as legal advice and some of the other ones on there, that the legislature allows to be discussed confidentially. You enter on a vote, procedurally, you enter on a vote. You do not have to vote to leave, because that could get awkward if nobody wants to leave. And so, or some do. And again, it's confidential. There's an admonition given at every executive session, and that's to remind everybody that the matters discussed, the information, and certainly any advice discussed will be confidential. And so that admonition is given every time, with very few exceptions. Every vote that you take would have to be come out in general session, and if the topic gets off track, then usually it would be me that helps guide that discussion to the confidential part, and then the rest of it is discussed in open session. If you're unsure about the best practice there, and I don't think I have to read all of them since we'll just give a high level view on executive sessions. Better to be safe than sorry. If you're unsure whether there's information that deserves executive session, then ask. Next slide, please. And again,
Lou, can I add just one piece?
Please.
So one of the other places where you would see the board as a whole go into executive session is if there were going to be information shared that were private, like student level information, which is rare at the board level. That would apply to any subcommittees as well. And we won't be sharing student level data or any personal identifiable information in this subcommittee. But I think this is just a good time to say a reminder to everybody. We don't want to use family name, student name, any identifying information. I know you all know that better than anybody else in the state, but just to make sure we say it on record, we want to be extra cautious to maintain student and family privacy.
Okay, next slide, please. No worries. Okay, public comment. Written comments and other board canon does accept written comments. There can be an open call to the public, but it's up to the board on whether it wants to do that. The public can talk about anything related, in this case, not the board, but the committee, the subcommittee. They can talk about things under your authority, so they don't have to be on the current agenda. As it says up there, they're not going to be holding a call. That makes it very easy. And all right, I think we're good on public comment. Sean?
Yeah, in case anyone was wondering, typically with subcommittees, there is not a call to the public. Call to the public can be rather lengthy. And since these are meetings that have a fixed time frame, there tends to be written comment instead of public comment, though it does not prohibit the committee at some point from doing a stakeholder meeting or doing a meeting where public comment is allowed.
All right, there I am. So just reminders to finish up. Open meetings are pretty vital for the public to let them take to watch and to participate. And on that point, people are actually watching you. They're so another one of those reminders that maybe doesn't need to be there. I think it often does, but they are going to be often recorded, and so just keep that in mind when you're here. A lot of different questions that I receive on open meeting law, nothing actually inappropriate happens. It's the appearance, and that is a social conversation, or if people are writing things down and when people don't want them to be, or et cetera. So just note that people are watching. So leading down, that can be about anything that you write down, and we can look at that as a public record. It may not be at all. Just keep that in mind. If in the off chance that there are electronic communications that have me or another attorney on it, it could very well be privileged, but just keep in mind that same caution about writing things down and when you really need to write things down. So otherwise, we talked about the executive session, and I think that wraps it up, Sean.
Thank you, Assistant Attorney General Caputo. Now I want to just provide the opportunity for members of the subcommittee to ask any additional questions or clarifying questions. Mr. Caputo, all right. Anyone online? No? Okay, seeing none, we're going to go ahead and move on to item 1E, Director Ross.
Vice Chair Clark, members of the committee. Up next, we have a presentation and discussion about norm setting. So as you all know, successful groups establish clear norms for behavior and communication to ensure respectful discourse and to move the work forward in a productive manner. The Special Education Evaluation Subcommittee will generate a brief list of norms today that you will vote upon to adopt. As you all are sort of volunteering what you would like to see, Melissa will be taking them down on the slide so that you can see and then ultimately see the list upon which you will vote. I'm going to ask on Melissa's behalf that we all be patient. It's so embarrassing to type in front of other people. You all know how it is. You could maybe be the best typist ever and your spelling is perfect, but the minute other people are watching, you're misspelling, we'll be patient, Melissa. We all know how that goes. So again, this will be sort of a brief item, but it's, really important on day one to establish those clear lines of communication and expectations for ourselves and for others. So Member Clark, if you'd like to see the.
Yes, members. Are there any members that would like to share some thoughts for some of the norms for the subcommittee?
Fine, I'll offer one. How about listen while others are speaking?
Thank you, Member Moyes.
I'll offer that we assume positive intent.
Thank you, Member Kaufman. Any other members online? Don't be shy. I promise this is a very casual process. Anything that you've been thinking about that will help facilitate the conversation of the committee, ensure professionalism, all of those are welcome.
Be an active participant, eliminating distractions.
Thank you, Member Kaufman.
That the committee's main focus be student-centered.
Thank you, Member Krivickas.
Hey, if I could be so bold, in having led a number of state initiatives over the years in different roles that I've been in, one of the things that we tend to talk about is that each person coming to a committee like this is bringing a unique and specific role, which is very important. Your expertise is vital. But in doing state level work, it's also important to be able to sort of step outside your role a bit and to understand that practices or processes might look different in different places. For example, when we're working with teachers, quite often we'll say, keep what you learned in your classroom, but realize that not all classrooms look like yours, right? That there are different models across the state. And so I would just say, keeping in mind the state level perspective of the work.
Thank you, Director Ross. Any others? I think we have opportunity for a few more before we vote as a committee.
I'll offer seek to understand others' perspectives.
Thank you, Member Tiffany. Okay, if we don't have any others. Sean, you want a few more there?
Sorry.
Sorry, Director Ross.
No, that's okay. And again, I apologize for interrupting. My mother is on my shoulder telling me, "Will be respectful." So I just would add respectful discourse. So
Thank you, Director Ross. That's great. Okay. Looks like we're wrapping up and I don't see any online. Just checking. I don't have my glasses on, but okay, well, Director Ross, then I can move forward with the motion. Thank you. Do I have a motion then to adopt the norms as presented for the Special Education Evaluations Subcommittee? Do I have such a motion?
I'll make that motion.
And they can just respond, so moved, correct?
So moved.
Thank you, Member Glass. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Member Kaufman. Oh, yes, sorry. So all in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any opposed? Motion passes. And we're now going to move on to item 1F. Director Ross.
Thank you, Vice Chair Clark. Vice Chair Clark, members of the subcommittee, the Individuals with Disabilities Act, IDEA, details the requirements for evaluations and determines eligibility to receive special education services. The overview of this overview of IDEA requirements for special education evaluations will provide information to ensure baseline understanding of federal law, not only for subcommittee members, again, acknowledging that you are experts in this field, but as important for members of the public who are viewing the meeting or who may view the meeting at a later time. We wanted to make sure to have that piece in this first meeting. The presentation will be delivered by our co-facilitator, Rory Fitzpatrick. Rory?
Yeah, hi, thank you so much. I think we're going to switch slide decks, yes?
Yeah, we are. Are you able to see your slide deck now? Maybe not. Give one second.
What I see on Zoom is the foundational is still the PowerPoint that you put together.
Yeah, we're updating it right now.
Sure, yeah, no problem. I've got a lot of screens open in front of me. Fantastic, there it is. Okay, fantastic. So thank you so much. What Director Ross asked me to do was just provide a bit of a grounding for us around what the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act requires for this work. And so, as you know, this committee is focused specifically on evaluation, and embedded with that is reevaluation. So just next slide, we'll just have a little quick orientation to what the Region 15 Comprehensive Center is. As I mentioned earlier, I'm here on behalf of the Comprehensive Center, who works with the Arizona Department of Education and State Board. The Region 15 Comp Center, directed by Kate Wright, who is, I believe, in your audience today, is one of 19 federally funded regional comprehensive centers with an overarching mission to provide capacity building supports to the states in a number of different areas. Special education can be on the list, and it's really up to the state to engage with the Comp Center on topics of urgent priorities for them. Let's go to the next slide. So getting into the actual IDA requirements, what I've done for you is provided hot links, and hopefully the members of the public can click on these if they wish to, for each of the sections about which we're going to speak. It starts when we talk about identifying students as potentially having a disability with an understanding of what the federally defined disability categories are. And you can see those listed here on the screen. This language comes specifically from the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Your state language may change slightly. For example, in some states, they refer to students who have behavioral concerns as emotional disturbance. In some cases, they use the term serious emotional disturbance, all leading up to the same kind of overarching requirements. The one place, and we'll talk a little bit about this in today and in the days to come, is that states are required to meet the obligations of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. They can specify additional regulations to help make sure that the practitioners are using expectations that fall in line with state definitions as well as federal. And one of those is the last one on this particular slide in the bottom right corner, around developmental delay. So the IDEA allows for states to define developmental delay, which is, kind of typically started out with early childhood. You can go up until the 10th birthday, and states can also limit that up till the 7th birthday. In Arizona, I understand that you allow the identification of students as having developmental delay until their 10th birthday. A lot of times that has to do with the intersection of continuing need for speech language services. So those are on the screen are the federal disability categories, and these are the places where there are specific requirements around how you identify what the potential disability category might be for a student. Let's go to the next slide. On this slide, you just get an overview of all the various sections that we're going to spend a few minutes talking about each. So we'll talk a little bit about parental consent. Then there's information about initial evaluations, followed by screening, which is not evaluation. This gets very technical. Many in the room could give this presentation equally well as, if not better than me. But for those of you for whom this is a little bit new, just know that it gets pretty jargony, and we'll all work together as a committee. Maybe we should have had that as a norm. We'll work together to support shared understanding. We'll talk about reevaluations. There are procedures specifically for how you identify a student as having one or more of those 13 disability categories. There's some additional requirements, particularly relative to the specific learning disability eligibility category, and we'll talk about that. So this is just a little bit of a table of contents for the slides to come. Let's look at the next slide. So of note, parental consent. This is really important. Parents are active members of processes to ensure that kids with disabilities, or kids without disabilities for that matter, are being treated in ways that are in their best interest, and specifically in this case, in ways that are within the confines of the law. So the content in IDA relative to parental consent speaks to specific requirements related to why, when, and how to engage parents. I'll say more about that in a minute, in providing permission for the evaluation of their children to determine potential eligibility for special education and related services. Just one note, so on each of these slides to come, on the left-hand side, you've got the section of 34 Code of Federal Regulations, CFR, section 300, which is the piece of regulations that speaks to IDA. And then, so they each start with that little mark with the S's. That's a section mark. Legal definitions. The lawyers in the room can help me with those legal terms. And then section 300 is the part of the Code of Federal Regulations. And then following the little dot or the period is, in this case, also the number 300. That's the specific section of IDA that speaks to this element. So each of these slides has the IDA citation and the regulation citation, and then what the section is. And then the content on the right is not legal language. These are my summaries of what's contained within that section of law. So as I mentioned, this first one is about parental consent. I said I would say something about parent. You'll note in the italicized text in the bottom right, the definitions of parents, which are pretty inclusive, right? So there are lots of ways to be the parent for a student with disabilities, or a student without disabilities for that matter. And you can see here just a note. So For example, if I'm a guardian or I am the grandparent of a student, and a student lives with me and I have the rights afforded to me as parent, IDA uses the term parent to take care of all those other categories. Director Ross, do you want me to take questions as we go, if there are any, or do you want me to go through this and then take questions? I don't know if there are any questions, but I just thought I'd ask.
Chair Clark, Vice Chair Clark, members of the board. I think questions at each slide might be helpful instead of saving till the end.
Yeah, I agree. I think questions at each slide. And then am I supposed to be recognizing the questions before they ask them?
So what we would do then is, as Rory finishes each slide, you would say, we'll pause for questions, and then we can move. If there are none, we can move to the next slide. Thank you.
So we'll pause here for questions. Do we have any questions before we move on to the next slide? Seeing none, we can move on.
Okay, thank you so much. So we'll go to the next slide. And here's where we start to get into the real meat here. So in initial evaluations, that's at section 301, it defines who can request an evaluation. So a parent can ask for an evaluation for their student. A teacher can recommend one. There are others who can recommend one. So the regulations speak to who can request. And then they also speak to the timing, which is really important. We don't want kids to sit on hold and not have their needs met while we wait for a system to catch up. So IDA specifies a 60-day, that's calendar day timeline, after receiving parental consent. Or as noted here, I mentioned a minute ago, states can change, the states can have more specific requirements as long as they're within the IDA requirements. So states are allowed to establish a different time frame if they want to do that. It can't be longer than 60 days. Arizona follows the 60-day timeline. You don't have a state-specific exception for that. This is one of those pause for question points. Vice Chair Clark.
Any questions? Seeing none, we can move on. Sorry, Rory, 1 second. Member Kravickas?
Hi, Rory. As we move through the committee, not necessarily now, it would be helpful for me if I knew like where other states stood, generally speaking. Like, do most other states have different timelines, or in other words, are we the exception or not, on a variety of different topics as we move through the committee?
Yeah, sure. I'll say that some states have gone to a 45-day timeline for evaluations. A lot of states maintain the 60-day timeline in this particular case. And I'll do my best to answer those. I may not know the answers today, but I can take a note and come back with information as we get into more specifics.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Member Jefferson?
I just want to offer I guess a question or a clarification. In Arizona, there's a 60-day timeline, but there's also a 15-day period of time when parents request an evaluation, which hinges on what is informed consent. So from a practical standpoint, Arizona is 75 days for an evaluation.
Thank you, Member Jefferson. Rory?
Okay, well, there could be a need for follow-up as we get into really defining these. We may need to figure out what the approach is going to be to make sure that we have all the technical information, because I work with states across the country and I am not a legal authority on Arizona regulations. So we'll just figure out how we're going to break down that information. Chair Hagerman and Vice Chair Clark, that's probably something for us along with Director Ross to figure out how we want to how we want to bring information in writing to the committee to ensure that everybody's looking at the legal requirements as we speak. Just a little note for later. Okay, let's move to the next one, please.
Well, one moment. We have one more question. Member Kravickas?
Thank you, Vice Chair Clark. Member Jefferson, can you repeat that? I didn't understand that.
In Arizona, you have parents can make a request for an evaluation, and the school system has 15 days to respond. And the 60-day timeline doesn't start until parents give informed consent, but informed consent is not defined. So for a parent who's making a request for an evaluation and they feel they're fully informed that they've made their request, hoping to start the 60-day timeline, it doesn't start until the school says, now we've met with you, now we're starting the timeline. So from a practical standpoint, it's a 75-day process, not a 60-day process.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
One moment, we have one more question from.
I just want to clarify what was just spoken to about consent when the time is right.
Yes, one moment. Member Murphy?
Yes, just to clarify for the parent, from the parent request, it's 15 school days and then it's 60 calendar days once the consent happens. So it's 15 school days, could be longer, will be longer than 15 calendar days. So, but just for the record, clarifying that.
That's an important distinction. Thank you, Member Murphy. Rory?
Yeah, thank you so much to both members. The federal law, as you can see on the slide, specifies completion within 60 days of receiving parental consent. In Arizona, it sounds like you have a rule, and I read about this, that you've got 15 days for achieving that consent. That's actually a really nice standard. In some states, they don't have specified timelines for how long it takes to achieve consent. And this can be an accidental delay when say, for example, a teacher believes that a student should be evaluated and you're trying to get consent from the parent. And for whatever reason, that consent is not timely. That process can go on a little bit longer. This is in my opinion, a good rule that you have a hard and fast 15 school days, it sounds like, for achieving parent consent, because it means that your state doesn't delay or just sort of leave kids hanging out there. So it's just, I don't want to disagree with the member. I'll say there's sort of two pieces. The first piece about 15 days is the time to get consent, and that can take longer in other states, as I said. And then it is 60 days from the day of consent. So technically the parental consent is the first day of the 60-day period, and you really do have 60 days. I just want to make sure that the committee is clear that it's not a longer time frame in your state than is allowed under IDA. And in fact, in some cases, it's probably a faster situation from referral to consent to evaluation.
Member Jefferson?
While I agree with you from a technical standpoint, from a practical standpoint, oftentimes parents are requesting evaluations because they have dire concerns for their children's ability to access the curriculum. So having those parents wait 15 school days, which might be 19 calendar days before we meet with them, sometimes delays getting students the support that they need. So, again, I understand when the 60 days starts, but from a practical standpoint, we're adding quite a bit of time on.
Thank you, Member Jefferson. Any other questions before we move on to the next slide? Seeing none, we can move on. Member Fitzpatrick.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to Member Jefferson. I'll say that, as you all talk through these things, understanding local context and the concerns that you hear are going to be really important. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so screening for instructional purposes that's not an evaluation. We want to be careful in the constructs of education not to just jump sometimes to the most intensive solution, right? And so these regulations at 302 speak to the idea that if a teacher or a specialist is just engaging in screening to determine appropriate instructional strategies, that's a good thing, right? So if students participate, I don't know, in Arizona, if they take the MAPS assessment, for example, or if a teacher self-creates, or there's a grade band of teachers who create an assessment to understand, okay, how are the kids in our third grade band within our school, who seems to be on track, who seems to not be on track, what are we trying to support those students who are not intuitively, receiving the levels of expectation that we would think would be appropriate. This piece of regulation just makes clear that those ongoing, what we might think of as called formative assessments, those formative assessments do not have the same legal definition as an evaluation for eligibility for special education related services. This sort of approach to formative assessment is just really good teaching and learning, and the law is careful to say those things are not the same things. Questions?
Seeing no questions, we can move on to the next slide.
Okay, reevaluations. So for the most part, an initial eligibility is for 3 years. So if a student is identified as having a disability, in 2020, then that evaluation is good until that certain date, that same certain date in 2023. And at which point then the student may be reevaluated. And so these regulations speak to the timing for reevaluation. It can't happen more than once a year unless the parent and the public agency agree otherwise. And the reason sometimes that we get into reevaluation earlier is perhaps, let's say that you have a student who is, under the category of developmental delay, and they're 8 and they're going to turn 11 before they have their next reevaluation, and you've got state law that says the developmental disability or developmental delay category ends at age 10. So that's a place where, for example, you might want to have an eligibility meeting prior to that 3-year. You don't want to get into too many evaluations, and as the regs speak to this, not more than once a year, just because it can be unduly burdensome on the system and can, inadvertently keep services from students that, are the best services. And you don't have to keep renewing eligibility more frequently than 3 years. There's a big misconception that the disability category that you have listed as your, right to special education under the process defines what your services are. But really, it should be the case. This is a challenge for practice across the country, but it should be the case that once you're eligible for special education related services, then you're eligible for all the services that would come regardless of your disability category. And that's really the purview of the individualized education program team, the IEP team, to decide what those special education related services should be. So we often hear, for example, that if I'm a student with autism, I get this kind of programming. If I'm a student with a speech language impairment, I get this kind of programming. And those things, while sometimes true in practice, are not true within the construct of the law, right? If you're eligible for special education and related services, you're eligible for any of the specially designed instruction and accommodations that can be provided under that moniker. So that's a little bit off track, but just speaks to this idea of why we might have reevaluations more frequently, and sometimes why there's a push from one side or the other, from a parent or from the district, to have the evaluation occur more frequently. But that said, it has to occur at least once every 3 years. And the reason for that being that we don't want students who may have been identified as needing special education to just languish in special education services if they don't need them, right? So a really good example is speech language impairment. Many children have articulation concerns that they grow out of with supports over time, right? So you wouldn't want a student who was identified as having a speech language need at age 5 still be eligible for special education services, say at 15 without any requirement for a reevaluation if that concern was resolved prior to that time. Questions?
Member Glass?
Hi, thank you. I just want to clarify the way it's worded on the slide that initial eligibility has a time limit, makes it sound like if you don't get your re-eval done at 3 years, you're exited from special education, and that's
Oh no. Yeah.
I just wanted to clarify that that's not actually the case. That there's a procedural requirement that we reevaluate at least once every 3 years, but you're not going to suddenly not be eligible just because your LEA doesn't get the eval done.
Right, your eligibility doesn't end per se. We can circle back to what at a different juncture, what the state's roles and responsibilities are for general supervision and monitoring to ensure timely evaluation. But it's more the exception than the rule that they're not timely reevaluations. Most states do fairly well with that requirement. And yeah, I understand what you're saying, but it's not as if you just don't do anything, you've got thousands of kids in Arizona who are just continuing to get services without current eligibility.
Right, but nor are they exited, right?
Correct, you're right.
Thank you, Member Glass. Other questions? And also as a note, if you're a member that's joining us virtually, make sure that you raise your hand because we can't see your faces on the screen during the presentation. Seeing none, we can move on.
Okay, so 304 just speaks to the evaluation procedures. It talks about notice to parents. We don't do things in special education without partnership from parents, including how we provide information to them so that they know what their rights are and their opportunities to engage in the process. Section 304 also speaks to specific requirements related to the assessment instruments that should be used for identifying various kinds of disability or categories of disability, and then administration thereof. What it does not do, and we'll talk about this later, is specify, like a specific vendor-based instrument. And we'll get into the reasons for that in a little bit, but it speaks to the kind of conceptual information that you need. It also talks about the expectations for what I'm calling the breadth and sufficiency of assessment. So, what are the kinds of considerations you need to give? What are the evaluation data? What's the sufficiency of those evaluation data in order to inform an understanding about the student and to try to understand whether or not the student is eligible for services under one or more of those 13 categories. And when I say eligible under one or more, let me be clear, you don't have to have multiple categorical eligibility in order to receive special education, as I said earlier. That said, sometimes there are reasons that evaluation committee decides it's appropriate to provide more than one category, but it's certainly not required under the law or expected under the regulations.
Okay, I don't see any questions. We can move on to the next slide.
Okay, so 305 is more requirements for evaluations and reevaluations. So it speaks to existing data. Remember earlier we talked about data that, teachers might be collecting, that kind of thing. So it talks to the importance of using all the data that you have available to you. It talks about determining levels of needs based on the data and thinking about the present levels of academic achievement and related developmental needs. So, part of the reason that you want to bring forward the consideration for eligibility for special education is because, one or more people have concerns that the current conditions of teaching and learning are not meeting the students' needs. So you want to think about what those needs are and what you know about those needs to that student-centered perspective that one of the members brought up as you're contemplating eligibility. They also specify how the review is conducted, including considerations related to timing for students who are graduating and for when students' eligibility and related services is terminated. So if it's called aging out of the system, right? So different states have different rules for how long students can be eligible, or for when students can graduate, including students with disabilities. The federal law allows for students to be receiving special education related services up until, I'm going to say up until 26th, but don't quote me here because I can't remember if it's the 26th birthday or the end of that year. I think it's the 26th birthday. And many states cease services for students with disabilities at age 22, some at 21. Member Kravickas, I'm not going to be able to tell you the differentiation off the top of my head for when students' services end. But that's that last piece has to do with timing for graduation. So questions?
Member Kravickas?
Thank you, Rory. I think it's 26. And the only reason I know that is because I was literally at a conference and someone randomly mentioned to me that I think it was Michigan or Wisconsin. And it took me off guard. I'd never heard that. So I guess there is at least one state I know of that it goes to 26. I think it's Michigan or Wisconsin.
Yeah, I think there are several, but and this is not for the purview of this committee, I don't think, but there's different reasons why you'd think about having services up till then. And then there's all sorts of considerations that you want to be thinking about if the student could receive services up until that age, having to do with the intersection with vocational rehabilitation and other adult serving agencies, because it wouldn't make sense for a 26-year-old student necessarily, for the most part, to be in a high school setting.
Any other questions? Seeing none, we can move on.
Okay, so 306, the actual determination of eligibility, it makes clear in the first one that this is not a fee for parents to engage in the public education system with regard to special education services. So, there's no cost to the parents for the evaluation, and there's no cost to the parents to provide copies of reports and documentation. Various states have different rules that school districts can use with regard to how many, copies you can get at no cost. And I won't dance into that territory, but for the most part, this is expected to be a no cost experience for parents to engage in the special education evaluation process for their children within the public school sector. There was mention earlier by one of the members who has experience with independent educational evaluations. We won't get into that, but sometimes those do have costs if those are at parent initiation. Okay, and then there's also in this section 306 considerations related to appropriate instruction, as well as to English language proficiency. And this group, I'm sure, will talk about that access to or lack thereof of appropriate instruction That's a lot of the criteria under specific learning disability speaks to that in particular. And as we get into the real weeds of the work around specific learning disability, I'm sure we'll be talking about that. There's also procedures for how you interpret the data. And then there's references in 306 to the development of, as I mentioned earlier, an IEP, the Individualized Education Program.
Seeing no questions, we can move on.
Okay, this one on the right, you've got a whole bunch of different regulations noted, right? 307, 308, 309, 310, and 311. These are very specific requirements related to the identification of a student as needing specific learning, as being eligible under specific learning disability. And if you're like, learning disability, you know, a lot of kids who end up with the category of specific learning disability, you know, are students who may have dyslexia or dysgraphia or dyscalculia, if those terms help you think about what this category is. So there are specialized methodological considerations that go along with that particular category. And then you can see here on the right as well, there's, you know, information about membership, including qualification of individuals to interpret the data. There's considerations related to age or state approved grade level standards, about thinking, you know, making sure that the disability is not the result of others' considerations, for example, limited English. And then there's also information in there about parent consent and timelines, because in this particular case, in some states, you have the opportunity to use additional data that's gathered through intervention processes. And this last piece is about making sure that students don't get, that their needs are not being ignored as they're in the middle of attempted interventions before special education identification, so that the timeline doesn't go on an undue period of time. This probably is the most complicated of the disability eligibility categories, just because it's got the most kind of elements to it and a lot of variation across the states. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that as we get into the real consideration and a line by line look at your particular evaluation regulations.
Seeing no questions, we can move on.
Okay. So let's just talk for a couple of minutes about the intersection of federal law and state autonomy. And I've already indicated this a couple of times, but we'll just look just slightly more deeply in the next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act spells out what all states have to do to meet the needs of students with disabilities. That is the floor, so that there is shared due process or procedural rights for all students across the country. As I mentioned earlier as well, IDA leaves room for states to interpret the rules and pass their own laws on how to apply them, right? Including through state board rules, state regulations, like what we're doing here. That said, when a state does move to adopt additional laws or regulations for the provision of supports for students with disabilities, they cannot contradict IDA. So there is that basic level of consistency across the country. There's that floor. And at the same time, state laws or regulations can't reduce, they can't make less than what the federal law requires. So some of what we'll do in this committee, as I understand it, is think about where are the places where Arizona wants to be more specific, or try to provide additional clarity to the field, to Arizona parents and educators, as to what we expect for eligibility and reevaluation for students with disabilities. So those are the kinds of things that we'll talk about in this committee, is, you know, where are the places where you just want to leave it up to the federal regulations as the guiding rule for your state, and where are the places where you want to provide more specificity for practitioners and parents in your state, understanding that they can't contradict what is in the federal law.
Seeing no questions, we can move on.
Okay, on the next slide, this is just a note. We've already talked a little bit about this. There's a range of variability, right? So how states choose to go about that, and Member Kravickas and other members of the committee, I'll do my best, as I said, to be able to speak to those off the top of my head. And then in some cases, I'm probably going to have to do a little research and come back to you. But there is wide variability across that. And then I think that's it for me other than any global questions.
Do members have any additional questions? Okay, thank you so much for that presentation, Member Fitzpatrick. Let's see here. Now we are going to move on to item 1G, Director Ross.
Vice Chair Clark, members of the subcommittee, I just want to echo thanking Rory for that presentation and for all of the work that not only she's done already, but has agreed to do as co-facilitator of the subcommittee. We're very, 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 very fortunate to have her with us. Up next, we're going to do just a quick presentation. Coming into this subcommittee, some sort of foundational principles were discussed and established by the board, and I want to make sure to share those with subcommittee members because the next item is going to transition into you sort of volunteering ideas for the subcommittee and work that you would like to see pursued. And so we're going to set just a few of the sort of foundational understandings here. So up first, it's just really answering that question of why form the subcommittee. C is our in-house abbreviation for it, Special Education Evaluations. As you all know, we love acronyms in education and especially in the government. So anytime we can create one and it's a fun one like that, we do it. So the purpose of the C is to review, revise, and modernize board rule. Just for some information, as a whole, special education rules, Article 4 were last looked at in 2017, but the rules for evaluation have not been fully reviewed in quite a while. And this is something that was, part of the impetus behind creating this subcommittee, realizing that it was well past time to take a look at these rules again. And as Rory said, making sure that there's alignment between state rule, board rule, state law, and IDEA. And then most importantly, and this is something I know we all agree with, the main purpose of forming this subcommittee and potentially future subcommittees for special education are to help improve student outcomes. I just put some broad data there from statewide exams, but we all know that you all devote your lives to this, and we all know that there's a lot of great work happening and still a lot of great work to be done. Next slide. And this is something I'm excited to talk about. Rory, when we met with Rory as we were forming the committee and putting things together, had a really interesting discussion with the board members and with me about the difference between procedures and practices, and what that looks like at sort of different levels of government, different levels of interaction. And so the subcommittee is really designed to review and revise special education rules and procedures. So operating really at that policy and procedure level. So as an example, rules, policies and procedures are rules that specify compliance expectations. So as an example, a valid and reliable universal literacy assessment must be used to determine if a student is struggling with reading, and then the tool must assess for specific elements. That's at the policy level. What you would then see at the practice level, where the sort of rubber meets the road, is PEAs choosing to use a specific vendor-created assessment to screen its students, which meets the requirements from the policy. So this subcommittee is really going to operate at that policy and procedure level, not at specifically the practice level, keeping in mind that Arizona by statute is a local control state. Rory, do you want to jump in here? You do a really good job of explaining this.
Well, I'll try to do that again, and members of the committee help me out if I forget to say things today that I said things about last week. But the one of the things that I said to start is that somebody once said to me that policy is a proxy for culture, right? If we had a culture of inclusivity, we wouldn't have to have a policy that said you needed to include kids with disabilities in your public education system, right? So the policy is the rule that tries to get to what should be happening, but practice is how it actually happens. So the thing you want to be careful about as a committee at the state level, making recommendations to the board, and then as a board adopting regulations, is what do you want the laws to be? What do you want the policies to be? I'll try to do one that has nothing to do with education, since sometimes that's a little easier. So in your state, you may have a law that says, you know, something about speed limits, right? And who the authority is to enforce the speed limits. But when it comes down to it, you know, you've got a police officer pulling somebody over and making decisions about how they're going to apply that. So maybe I'll back away from this example just to say you want to be careful to regulate at the policy level the expectations you have for how the system will behave, but you want to give some autonomy to, in this case, the school district in partnership with families, how you're going to implement those. So my example, I think, was about an IEP meeting when I spoke last week. Let's just say that you're going to have under IDA, right? There's a requirement that a member of the individual education program team, the IEP team, be a general education teacher. And this is also in the evaluation stuff, right? So in initial evaluation, it says you should have the student's teacher. But if the student's teacher is not available, you should have someone who is familiar with the grade level curriculum for that particular grade level for the student. The reason you don't only limit it to having the student's teacher is that for whatever reason, the student's teacher may not be available. Say that the student's teacher went on maternity leave and is not available at the time that the eligibility committee is meeting. You would not want to delay that eligibility decision until the teacher came off of maternity leave to make that decision. You have a replacement situation in this case. So you don't want to be so tightly binding in that in how the practitioners implement the law that the law comes to a screeching halt. So there's this fine line between this is what we want for students with disabilities in our state or students who may have disabilities, and this is how we actually undertake the practice of those. So you specify, you know, for example, as on the screen here, you specify for a student who may have intellectual disabilities, you specify the kinds of data that the team needs to look at, but you don't specify you will use this particular assessment created by this vendor as of this date. Because what happens if you've got that in regulations and then the vendor assessment, you know, something happens and you're like, oh, we found out that that's not a good tool, or the vendor stopped making the tool. So you don't want to tie the hands so much that the process grinds to a halt for individual students. But other members of the committee, that when we talked about this last week, are there other things that are coming up for you that you'd share?
There's no questions at this time.
Thank you, Rory. Next slide. And so just a few more of the foundational understandings, some of which have arisen during this meeting already. You know, obviously the committee will use IDEA as the baseline for its work. As Rory has said a number of times, states can augment federal law, but they can't contradict or do less than is called for in federal law. The subcommittee will remain focused on the rules related to special education evaluations for public schools. It was a very purposeful choice by the board to have this be a special education evaluation subcommittee instead of a broader special education subcommittee. The idea was by zeroing in on specific topics of need in specific areas, more focused work could be done in a shorter time versus perhaps another approach of doing a general special education subcommittee, you know, which could meet for years potentially. And so it's really about keeping things focused and doing more in sort of shorter bursts. And so really remaining focused there. And then one of the chief questions, you know, that I received as we were putting all of this together is about empowerment scholarship accounts. So I just want to say not only to the subcommittee, but to people, you know, watching and listening, this committee will not address rules, policies, or practices related to ESA. It is very affixed in the K-12 space and in the rules related to K-12 special education evaluation, public school, public district, public charter, K-12 special education. I think that might be the last of that slide. Okay, you can go back one, Melissa.
Do any members have any questions or need any clarification? Okay, seeing none. So Director Ross, thank you for that presentation. We are going to move on to item 1H. Director Ross.
Thank you, Vice Chair Clark, members of the subcommittee. So this is our last formal item for the day, and we left some space for it because we weren't sure how much time folks would need or want for this. But oh, can you go to the next slide, please, Melissa? So this is the time where committee members will now provide feedback on topics related to special education evaluations that they would like to have addressed during the work of the subcommittee. During the discussion, board staff will collect that feedback, and we will then provide it to Rory, to Chair Hagerman, and Vice Chair Clark as future meetings are planned. This isn't there's no guarantee that a topic that comes up might be addressed or not addressed, but this is a chance for the committee to just give that initial feedback, again, to help shape the work moving forward.
Absolutely. So is there anyone that would like to start us off? Okay, well, I will start us off then. One of the topics of concern I would like to add to this list is what Member Jefferson brought up, which is the 15 days and all the kind of information surrounding that process of when a parent requests and what that meeting looks like and what happens kind of after that. Member Murphy?
Just to add on to that, one issue that I get comments from families is when you have that 15 school day window, the meetings get set in that window, but then they have the meeting and then consent is not there at the meeting. They don't get presented. And then there's this sort of vague or sort of undefined period of time. They've had the meeting in 15 school days, but consent is not provided to the parent. And then the 16 calendar days doesn't start. So just having that as part of that discussion, just to say that, when we're talking about, if we are continuing to talk about a 15 school day meeting, that we're also prepared to have consent be obtained at that meeting. Obviously, the parent has the right to decide on consent issues, but in terms of just that delay that sometimes gets built in, that's a little bit undefined.
Thank you, Member Murphy. I've got Member Pearson and then Member Chapman after.
One of the reasons that has come up is the monitoring department out of the from the Department of Ed has told districts that we cannot get consent at that meeting. We have to issue prior written notice first and give parents the opportunity to consider their options, and then we are allowed to get consent. So if there is something that we can do to address that piece, I think that would help.
Thank you, Member Pearson. Member Chapman?
Yes, the Department of Education is currently reviewing our practices surrounding consent, and I would want to have a type of flow chart or something that we could discuss, starting with consent and all the way through the evaluation process.
Thank you, Member Chapman. Member Kravickas?
I would second that. I probably know the least about this, so a flow chart would be helpful. And at what point in that process does Arizona deviate from federal law and going above and beyond? And to the extent possible, other state examples to kind of give me context. Like I didn't know about the issue date Member Jefferson brought up. So I'm excited to continue to learn more, but that would be really helpful.
Member Jefferson?
I have a couple of things I wanted to call out. One, the purpose of special education evaluations is to identify all suspected areas of disability. I think that the subcommittee could have some discussion around the intersection of medical needs and educational implications. It is not at all uncommon for parents to request evaluations because they're concerned their child might have a auditory processing disorder or visual motor integration difficulty, and to hear back, well, that's a medical issue, you need to address that medically. So I do think that it would be worthwhile to have some further discussion. The second area, I think that it is vague at best on what do we do with students who do speak a second language when we're conducting that initial evaluation, and when would it be appropriate to determine that we need to do that evaluation both in English and in a second language, especially for students we've already identified are ELL, but the team is saying we need to move forward with special education evaluations. And then the third thing I wanted to call out, if the purpose of the evaluation is to identify these suspected areas of disability and we're seeking parents' informed consent, there's no uniformity around how we're notifying the parents what is going to be evaluated from a domain standpoint. So some districts will say we're going to look at social emotional, and in their mind that includes autism, and other districts will specifically say no, we're going to evaluate for autism. And because there isn't clarity across the board, I think it certainly makes it difficult from helping a parent to understand exactly what you're intending to do.
Thank you, Member Jefferson. Member Glass.
I have a couple as well to add. So kind of similar to what's been talked about with the English language issue, I just would want to add to that within that conversation, bringing in American Sign Language for deaf and hard of hearing, or any family that identifies ASL as a primary language, and the need for ASL proficient psychologists or ASL interpreter along with a deaf interpreter. I'm hoping we can have a conversation about preschool categories of eligibility, which is covered by IDEA Part B and related to eval. So hoping that can be part of the conversation in the subcommittee. Additionally, giving parents copies of the evaluation report. I know there are other states where that report is provided at least a certain number of days in advance of the actual MET meeting, so that parents have an opportunity to review it. Baseline for IDEA and FERPA is that you can get it before the meeting, but without specification of how many days. So I think that's something we could look at if we want to go above and beyond in Arizona. Talking also about IDEA parents, I know Rory discussed that a little bit, what's included as an IDEA parent. I do a lot of work with the foster care community, and I know there was recently a juvenile court rule in the state adopted that requires the juvenile court to identify who the IDEA parent is. So possibly having some kind of reference within state policy to the need for a cross-reference between the state courts and the schools to figure out who that person is. And then also aligned with what Member Jefferson was saying, that screenings, I think universally schools require vision and hearing screenings as part of the eval process. And I have seen in the past where, again, a school will say, oh, you failed that, you need to go to your medical audiologist or optometrist and get cleared before we can move forward. And that can end up delaying the evaluation process. So just perhaps a little more detail and policy about what should happen when a student, I know there has been guidance, but we continue to see it happen. So something more in policy about what should happen when a student fails a screener for something like that, and how it should not delay further evaluation. Thank you.
Member Jefferson?
One other area, there's as part of the evaluation process when determining whether or not we're going to move forward with evaluations, we're also looking to see if the student has been provided appropriate instruction. I think it's specific to, at least in my mind, it's carved out with regard to specific learning disabilities. However, because the language is there, frequently we might have a student who has another health impairment. Let's say they've been diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and the parents saying, my child's struggling, we feel like we need to move forward with the special education evaluation. Because that language is not necessarily specific to a specific learning disability, school systems often will refuse to move forward with an evaluation, and they take kind of a wait and see approach. And so I think it's something we should at least look at.
Thank you. Member Pearson?
For a process for homeschool and private school students, because we do get a lot of requests for students who have been homeschooled or placed in private schools. And we don't have background information on them, so we are unable to do a comprehensive review of existing data or even make a determination about whether or not to move forward with evaluation. I know in some districts with the preschool process, they come in and they do screenings, age appropriate screenings, and then make a determination based on that. So if there's a process that we can create that would help assist schools in knowing whether or not they need to move forward with evaluation for homeschool and private school students.
Member Jefferson?
I definitely agree with what Member Pearson called out. I think also probably some more robust discussion about what do we do with a student whose parent has exercised school choice. And so the student is coming to them with the best information we have available. They have an evaluation from a licensed professional in the state. We have feedback from whomever is providing instruction, because oftentimes that feedback, which is the best information we have, is discounted. And so the parents are told, well, even if all of this is correct, we met your child last week and we don't think they need special education because we don't know them. And so I think maybe more discussion about how do we handle it when we have those students, especially as our state continues to embrace school choice. What do we do with those students to ensure that their needs are met and appropriately identified?
Thank you. Member Testa?
Had a couple of thoughts. Some of the special education disability criteria include language about the disability adversely affecting educational performance. And I think that's a little open to interpretation, if we might be able to address that a little bit further. Also, the criteria for specific learning disabilities is also a little bit open to interpretation, and there are different models that we could potentially discuss, as well as under the disability category of other health impairment. Specifically with regard to ADHD, there's been some federal legislation that suggests that school psychologists can adequately identify ADHD in the school setting, and a medical note from a doctor outside of the school setting is not required, though I have seen some school districts still following requiring outside documentation. So if we could potentially address that as well, that might be helpful.
Great suggestions. Thank you. Member Krivickas, and then I'll come back to Member Jefferson.
Oh, thank you so much. I wholeheartedly echo what Member Testa just iterated. I did have one, and it was something that came up during Rory's presentation that I hear a lot in the field is I think there's room for clarification and consistency on that the label shouldn't drive the services. I don't know what that would look like, but I hear that often, and obviously it's true, but I think there's misunderstanding, confusion of what that means. And so families think I have to have that disability diagnosis to get what my kid needs. And I think it's supposed to be the other way around. So I think clarification would be helpful.
Vice Chair Clark, I'm also just remembering to check in with the folks online.
Thank you. Let me go to Member Jefferson, and then I'll circle to anyone online. Thank you.
I just wanted to expand on the point that Dr. Testa brought up related to students with a specific learning disability. Currently, we have 3 means to make that determination: a discrepancy between achievement and ability, a child's response to specific research-based interventions, or all other alternative research-based procedures. There is no consistency whatsoever with how a school system determines what that discrepancy is. And so you could be within one community and go district to district and hear completely different discrepancies that they're looking for. And then if you take that one step further, a child's response to specific research-based interventions, frequently parents will hear back, well, we've been doing RTI or we've been doing these interventions, but there's no data of any kind available to illustrate what the student's response was, other than they're responding just fine. So I do think, and then as of late, some districts have went to this pattern of strengths and weaknesses, which at best is convoluted and at worst is deceiving, because you can't pin down a straight answer on what that means from psychologist to psychologist to psychologist, leaving parents really confused and at a disadvantage, because there is no, hey, every district is going to do it one of these 3 ways, and here's a resource that could actually explain it to you.
Thank you, Member Jefferson. And let me just take a moment. I apologize for anyone that might have feedback online.
So
Dr. Hagerman?
My feedback was just going to be along the questions we're having around specific learning disabilities. So it's being captured in the notes so far.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Hagerman.
And I'm going to have to excuse myself. I apologize. I'm about to give my graduate students a final exam on the identification of specific learning disabilities. And I can see them filing into their classroom across the hall from me. So I look forward to our next meeting, and thank you for including me.
Thank you, Member Spencer. Member Pearson?
Just to bounce off of what Member Jefferson said, there is a lot of inconsistency between districts on how we identify SLD. But going to the point of, we don't want to make things so tight that we limit the school district's flexibility to identify, because we've seen with some kids where they may not meet that strict criteria of the discrepancy. But if you look at all of the information as a whole, teams right now have that flexibility to make a determination that a student is eligible as a student with a specific learning disability. So whatever we do with SLD, we need to make sure that we maintain some flexibility that gives teams the opportunity to look at the entirety of the student, and not just that strict discrepancy.
Thank you, Member Pearson.
Okay.
Member Moix?
I'll echo what Member Pearson also said, is leave school districts some flexibility with regards to that. I think it's important, partly because of what Member Jefferson said. There is no consistency, and it is a source of frustration among school psychologists around the country, for that matter, that no one can really articulate what a specific learning disability is, much less how to identify it, and it becomes frustrating. So I wouldn't want this committee to take on a strict definition for the state, which might further exclude more children from getting special education supports if they need it. In regards to items that I'd like to talk about, it relates to the timeline. In the state, we have certain timelines related to evaluations and IEPs, for that matter, that are school days and some that are calendar days, and it becomes confusing. And while I would not want to shorten the timeline, speaking as a school psychologist, I think having some consistency related to school days versus calendar days would be beneficial, just given the varying calendars around the districts, and timelines stopping or starting. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Moix. Member Pearson?
I was part of that group when we were looking at the 15-day issue. And I think a lot of the reason why we had that initial timeline was the rule was originally parents make a written request. The district has 60 days from receipt of the written request. And what we were running into is that people weren't available to meet until day 50, and then students weren't coming to school for days 50 through 60. And we were also receiving a lot of requests 2 days before summer break started, and we don't necessarily have staff. And because of the rules related to the composition of IEP teams and MET teams, it was the districts that were doing summer evaluations were then out of compliance for having the correct team members available for those evaluation meetings and the drafting of the IEPs. So to Matt's point, I think the school days and the calendar days kind of do throw things off, but there was some thought behind the reason why it was set up that way.
Thank you, Member Pearson. Member Jefferson?
I think that one thing that, as we do dig a little bit further, we have to try and strike a balance between the interests of everybody. And if our focus is the child and making sure the students have what they need, some of the approach that I think just the practical application of the approach is we almost treat parents like they just don't know anything. And when a parent's requesting an evaluation, oftentimes I find parents are extremely informed about all aspects of what they're asking for. But the way the system is currently functioning, there's an assumption that the parents don't know anything until they've sat with the school and the school informed them, and then they can make informed decisions. And I just think we have to figure out what that balance is, because sometimes parents are striving to get their child support and they've been on this journey for a long time. And that 15 days may sound minor, it's only 15 days, but sometimes this is the second or third time the parents made the same request because they have data that suggests their child's struggling. So I just think we have to really think about how we find that balance.
Thank you, Member Jefferson. And I'll echo a topic of concern that I'd like to add regarding parents being unable to request evaluations for about a 3-month period from wherever the end of the school year is to the beginning of the school year. I think a lot of folks are unaware that a lot of evaluations, depending on the district, are not happening during the summer. And based on some conversations I've had with Member Krivickas, I'd like to also add a topic of concern that can hopefully be a something that we think about throughout the whole time that we're doing this committee, which is parent transparency. parent transparency in the process of what's happening next. That's just something that we could do a lot better on. So I think it's a topic of concern that we could address. Member Jefferson?
Two other things came to mind. One is, I think currently school systems are reluctant to proceed with evaluations during the first 45 days of the school year because they want to gather that time. And I think it kind of dovetails off of what you shared. We might have students that were in that district at the end of the last school year, and now we've come back and the parents are saying, okay, you didn't want to do the evaluation because it was April and you said all your spots were full. Now we're in August and you're telling me you want to wait 45 days. So I think that that's a piece. The other piece that I wanted to call out that I think we should have some discussion about, what role do private evaluations play? Because oftentimes you'll have parents who have invested resources, financially, time, energy to go and to seek out some of our great private psychologists that are in the community, neuropsychologists, and they bring that evaluation and it's almost looked at like, okay, we'll put that off to the side because it's really only going to matter when we do the evaluation. And I think it could be worthwhile for the team to discuss, like, are we expending resources needlessly when we have good evaluations that are coming in and they're giving us information? It's not uncommon for me to see school systems redoing cognitive assessments that were done by a private psychologist a month prior. And at some point, it just seems silly, especially when we're talking about the resources that we're trying to maximize.
Member Kravickas?
Wow, so many great comments. I'm not even sure where to start. I know I wanted to thank Member Pearson for one of the things. I don't even remember what you said, but I'm like, I made a note, thank her. So many great comments. One of the things I did want to say is, and maybe it's almost a meeting norm, is recognition that we have all these timelines and statutes and regulations and stuff, but to the point of the parent's journey has been going on for years, and really, really recognizing that. Parents see this stuff at home and it's a really, really emotional, difficult journey. So we're thinking about this in the very specific context, and that is our legal purview and what we're here for. But I think it's worth remembering that the parent's journey often started at birth or that initial diagnosis, and it's really, really, really hard. I wanted to acknowledge the summer problem. I don't know what the solution is, but I did have a question, perhaps for staff or Rory. Is the IEP team membership in IDEA, the requirements, or is it in our state board rule?
Vice Chair Clark, Member Kravickas, we'll have to look into that question.
Okay.
I can answer that.
Yeah.
Member Pearson?
So the federal rules set out who are the members of the IEP team, but here in Arizona under statute, the MET team is defined as the IEP team and then the relevant members of the evaluation team. So here it is different in statute that the IEP team is also the MET team plus the extras.
Thank you for that answer. Back to one of the things that Member Jefferson brought up that I've heard a lot from parents is I understand the legal difference between the medical and the educational impact. I get that, but there's not an understanding. So if you go out and spend your own money, usually to do an eval, I think one of the things that would be helpful is if we had like almost like a cover sheet or a one pager that eval, because the parents maybe don't know to tell the doctor to look for these educational components. They did just a medical evaluation, and it might be helpful having gone through that to say, okay, make sure you specifically fill this part out, or that can come back to the team that would help with that issue, because I feel the same way. I mean, we have such tight resources at the school level. I wouldn't want them to be duplicative.
Thank you, Member Kravickas. We'll go to Member Kreis and then Member Murphy.
Yeah, I just wanted to continue on this conversation, and I agree with the things that you're saying. I'm relating mine more towards the independent evaluation process, but it definitely is a challenge when our families get an outside evaluation and then come to a school and there is some conversation disagreement. We do set very clear parameters of what an independent evaluation is supposed to be, and that it needs to include a school observation. And we have no way to hold an independent evaluation accountable for that. And so we can set our criteria. We can say this is exactly everything that needs to be in it. And a family can go choose to do something completely outside of that criteria. And a school's only option is to file due process against a family, which is a very contentious and then doesn't help the situation at all. So I think there's a lot of work to do there around those outside evals and how to make it connect, be transparent, not feel like it's a one side versus the other, and not have families thinking they're heading down a path and then feeling very frustrated when that doesn't work for them.
Thank you, Member Crace. Member Murphy?
Yes, one other issue I wanted to raise as a topic is when parents request evaluations, particularly initial evaluations, the school under the regulations has a right to say, we just don't see it and we're not going to do an evaluation. And what they're doing is they're reviewing the data that they have, which I always have found as a disconnect with the regulations that the initial evaluation can be a review of existing data. So they're reviewing data without the parent, and then they come back to the parent and say, we decided that we don't want to do the evaluation. They can issue a prior written notice, and then the parent they don't have IEE rights, independent educational evaluation rights. So they're kind of stuck with their procedural safeguards, which is to do a due process. But I think I'd like to look at that to see what is that criteria, because it sounds like we're excluding parents from that process, and it seems like that's what we're doing. So I see how that overlaps with the requirements for a review of existing data evaluation. So
Thank you, Member Murphy. I've got Member Jefferson and then Member Glass.
Sorry. It is not uncommon at all for me to see school systems now who will just issue a prior written notice and say, okay, we'll do the evaluation, and they'll just send parents a list of things they're going to test, because it's not clear in the regulation that meeting with the parents as part of the review of data is required. Most districts, I think, use common practice and they would meet with the parents, but not all. Some just, here's a permission to evaluate, you requested this, and they never have the discussion, which I think really omits this critical piece, which is understanding the parent's perspective on what they see. And then the other piece I wanted to call out, and I think Member Crace had mentioned observations, and that's also another area that probably would warrant further discussion, because everybody seems clear fairly universally, you're supposed to do an observation, especially as it relates to specific learning disabilities. But I certainly will see evaluations where nobody did an observation. So it's not uncommon at all. And it seems like it gets maybe worse, at least from my experience, when kids get to high school level. So nobody's evaluating these students to actually see what did they look like in the classroom. And just from a process standpoint, I think that there's maybe some room for refinement, because some of these parts of the regulation aren't crystal clear that that's what should be expected.
Thank you, Member Jefferson. Member Glass?
Thank you. We've been talking a lot about initial evaluation, which I think there's a lot to talk about there. I just want to bring up also for reevaluation processes. Something that I've seen frequently, and I think Rory went over it, is that every 3 years, yes, there has to be a conversation about reevaluation, but there's the opportunity for if the school and parent agree, they can waive the reevaluation. And I've also seen in IEPs this opportunity to, well, we're going to have a reevaluation where we all meet and we call it a MET, but we actually haven't collected any new data. We're just reviewing old data. And again, if everyone's on board, that's fine. There's no need to collect new data if everyone agrees it's not necessary. But I do think, what I have seen often is that there'll be kiddos who the last time they were actually tested, they were 6 and now they're 17. And we've just been relying on reviewing existing data over and over. So I think there's a box on many IEP forms. I'm not sure universally if it's there, where it says parents were informed they could ask for more testing and they said, that's fine, I don't need it. But I think most parents don't really understand what they're agreeing to in that situation. So something about talking more about, do we actually need to collect more data, new data, or is this reevaluation, is it okay for us to just rely on existing data? And then within that there's 2 purposes for collecting more data. One is to determine continued eligibility. And if you have a kid with, a severe intellectual disability or something where we know that they're still going to be eligible, we don't need new data for continued eligibility. But there is the second purpose, which is having that data in order to create a more appropriate IEP that is going to provide them with FAPE. And so making sure that both of those purposes for new data are discussed before a decision is made not to do new assessment at reevaluation time.
Thank you, Member Glass. Any other broad topics of concern that you would feel like member?
To Member Glass's point, when we have students that have significant cognitive disabilities, a lot of those standardized assessments aren't going to give us good information that's going to help drive IEP services. And so looking at what are some other kinds of assessments or things that we can be doing to help IEP teams make appropriate decisions for students. As a parent who has a kid who doesn't test well, I mean, those assessments don't mean anything to anybody for him. So looking at the other things that we can do to help support teams and help support students so we have good updated information for students.
Thank you, Member Pearson. And I know that list is getting long, but I will just remind everybody that this is good. This is what we're here for, and this is what this time is all about. So let's not be nervous about the list. Is there anybody else that wanted to add a topic of concern? Member Pearson?
I do have one more, and Dr. Moix might throw something at me as I say this. But there is a form in Arizona that allows us just to waive evaluations altogether without sitting down, without doing a review of existing data meeting. And it's just everybody signs it and moves on with their day. And there is the provision for that in the law, but I don't think it's good for kids, and I don't think it's good for districts because it also puts us in a position of not having updated information. So maybe doing something with that waiver.
Thank you, Member Pearson. Other members, topics of concern? Member Jefferson?
I think it might also be fruitful to have a discussion about evaluations that are done to the point that was made earlier to gather good information about how we develop an IEP that's going to provide FAPE. You know, there are evaluations that are done that aren't necessarily going to determine eligibility. So we do occupational therapy evaluations all the time, and there's no eligibility that's related to that. But there are other evaluations that we do that might be appropriate, but I think it's a little vague and it's somewhat subjective about who's going to do them and when and why. One of those might be a functional behavior assessment. So sometimes parents will ask for functional behavior assessments and they're met with resistance because, well, we only do functional behavior assessments if your kid's demonstrating externalized behaviors. And so there are perceptions about when and why you would do that evaluation. I think that could be clarified. And then something that I've seen over the years, but it's come up more recently, there are evaluations to determine, to support students that have disabilities with identifying leisure time activities. So recreation therapy, for example, is a related service under the IDEA, but there's over the years, there's been a lot of resistance to even looking into that area. And that's an area of practice. Many states kind of delve into that. But again, we kind of have our standard in Arizona. We typically do these types of evaluations. And so when we're looking past that, I think it could be worth some discussion.
Thank you, Member Jefferson. Member Pearson?
Thank you, Member Jefferson, for triggering something for me. We have times where we do a functional behavioral assessment and it's in between that 3-year period, or we do a speech evaluation or an OT evaluation, again, in the middle of that 3-year period. And we're only looking at that one very specific issue, but there is a redetermination of eligibility at that time. And so that resets that 3-year evaluation date. So a student may go 5 years without having achievement testing or cognitive testing done because we had done an occupational therapy evaluation. So some clarification on when we're doing like related service types of evaluations in the midst of that 3 years, whether or not, because right now that is resetting that 3-year timeline, and maybe not resetting that 3-year timeline if we're doing those types of evaluations in between that 3-year block. Because I've seen teams where they've done a functional behavioral assessment and they reset the 3-year timeline, even though they hadn't done necessarily all of the evaluations.
Thank you, Member Pearson. Member Crace?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a topic for up here, but just as we're sharing these things, I think I just want to throw out there that like we make sure that we're going back to IDEA and what does it currently say? What does Arizona statute say? do we already have a law that addresses this and we have a practical problem with how people are doing things? Not to like the FBA one is what made me think of that. Under IDEA, and Heather, correct me where I'm wrong, but the only time an FBA is required is at manifestation. So we have the IDEA saying this is when it's required, but a tool that is used in many other ways. And so just looking at those different pieces as we go through with this of like, hey, that did happen in a school district, but what that school district did was against the law, and there were procedural things to address there versus, hey, this is a global issue that we need to change policy on.
Thank you, Member Crace. And I think that hits to something that we talked about before that Member Krivik has brought up too, is the opportunity as we're kind of putting this all together with staff to look at IDEA, state law, and then to broaden that also and look at what are other states doing, what are potential changes or opportunities that we may have in Arizona throughout this committee's work. Other member feedback on topics of concern to add to the list? Might be getting to the end. Member Crace?
I don't know that it's really a concern, but I deal with a lot of out-of-state evaluations and students transferring in and that process of the transfer and what that looks like and trying to get the records from a private school in Utah that's closed. Sorry, that was an example that happened this year. But that transfer process is hard, especially when families are coming from out of state.
Great. Thank you very much, Member Crace. I agree. Other topics? Yeah, Member Glass, absolutely. No,
I just have one
please.
more that came to mind. So we have, in the wake of COVID and for many other reasons, a lot of attendance issues, which I'm sure everybody agrees with, like school refusal, anxiety, and just lack of attendance. And that can be hard when we're looking at, you know, is this an educational disadvantage versus is there an underlying disability and that kind of thing. So maybe looking somewhere at the issue of, and I think Heather brought up, or Member Pearson brought up as well, that how do we get an evaluation done if the kiddo's not in school? And so maybe some kind of exploration of that. What kinds of testing can be done when it's hard to actually have in-person interaction with a student?
Thank you, Member Glass. Member Moix?
And I don't know that it's a concern necessarily. It's just, I want to be mindful as we're doing this, that I know we're talking about evaluations, which is the crux of this, but sometimes it sounds like the goal is to get a kid into special education. And I would think most people, school psychologists in general, would argue that we don't want to do that. And then there are times we can address the needs of the child through tiered systems of supports without giving the child a disability or identifying them as having a disability. And I would hope this committee could keep that in mind, or at least we could talk about some ways to do that.
Thank you, Member Moix. Any final topics of concern? Members online? No. Okay. All right. Well, thank you everyone for your feedback on the areas of focus and concern. We are now moving to item 2. Director Ross.
Vice Chair Clark, members of the subcommittee, thank you so much for a very fruitful conversation. I took notes as I could. I literally couldn't see what I was typing. For those of you who are old enough, I have like Mr. Magoo level eyesight, and so I'll clean it up and I'll have that sent out to all of you in the next couple of days, so everybody can review the feedback and have it actually spelled properly. So this is the part of the meeting where we just discuss upcoming meetings. There is no meeting in January. There are just some logistical pieces. One, school breaks going into certain dates, and then the ability to have people here from out of state or out of the county, and then also booking the room. So our next meeting will be February 1st, and then it'll be within the first week of each month following, with a couple in June, so that folks, if needed, you know, obviously go on vacation in July. These are not necessarily mandatory meetings. We just have made sure to book out the first half of the year. The committee may decide that its work is done much earlier than this. The subcommittee may just decide that it needs more meetings, which we can obviously look at as we go, but we wanted to at least logistically have everything in place, rooms reserved, all those kinds of things. We will also be sending out formal invites to all of you for these meetings, so those will be coming for your calendars. And as always, there will be in-person or virtual options. Just for those of you who may not have participated in this type of work before, what will happen is the board staff will gather all of the feedback from today, and then we'll meet with Rory, with the chair, with the vice chair, and map out agenda items to come. And then the agenda will be published again at least 12 days before each meeting. That's the sort of standard here at the board. There was obviously that couldn't happen this meeting because the board had to vote to approve you all as a roster on last Monday. And then the agenda was published, I think, at 3:00 that day. So there was a week between, but there will always be at least 12 days. And it'll, again, 9 to 12 at this building. I believe the next meeting is one of the ones we have to have on the first floor, but we'll send out instructions about that. So that's actually it.
Thank you. And the only other question I had, Director Ross, is that you mentioned at the very beginning about opportunities for all the different stakeholders that everyone on the committee represents to potentially provide written stakeholder feedback. Could you explain what that process will look like or how they will be notified of that?
Yes, thank you. In fact, that was a good reminder, Vice Chair Clark. I wanted to also guide each of you very quickly, as much as I can from this angle, on how to see the agendas, if it's not something with which you are familiar. Yeah, will you do it, Melissa? So Melissa will guide you. We'll take you to the state board website here, and we'll show you how to find materials. And in every agenda, there are instructions on how to submit written comment. The deadlines for submitting written comment. The deadline is always the Thursday at noon before whatever the committee or board meeting is. So if you have folks who want to submit written comment, they would do so before that date. And then it will be added as attachments to the agenda, which you will all be able to see. So, where Melissa's going is just the State Board of Education webpage. And on that webpage, if you scroll down, they have upcoming committee meetings, and you'll see the special education committee meetings. You'll see a link. And we actually have 3 subcommittee meetings going on today, which is why, we have 2 A through F technical advisory committees literally happening right now as well. Oh, is it not? Okay, so this would be where you would go. It for some reason isn't updating, but the link will be there for the meetings. And then there's always a link that says meeting materials. You'll see it under calendar. But there's always a link when you go to the meeting that shows you. So there's the agenda, and then so that's the agenda for this meeting. And then on the front page for meetings, you will see a button that says meeting materials. It's on the web page, Melissa. And if you go to the meetings, it'll be on there. So if you go to the meetings tab, it'll be on there. You went to hearings. Yeah. Hey, we'll send you the link. It's much simpler than this, but either way, what you can do is, and you can actually do this for any board meeting. There's the button that says board meeting materials. It takes you to a program called Simbly. When you click on meetings up at the right there, and allow you to search for all the meetings. So this one probably is listed as prior at this point. Or no, there it is. So if you click on that, you'll see the expanded agenda, and it has all of the materials. It has the PowerPoint, all PowerPoints you saw today as attachments. Any written comment would be in there as attachments. To make it easier for you all, we will also send you a follow-up email after every meeting that just contains any materials that were shared, and a reminder of the upcoming meeting as well. So even though we're walking you through where to find it, we'll also always send you this ahead of time. So.
And Director Ross, just to triple, quadruple clarify, because this process is very confusing for people who aren't used to it. For professionals or parents that want to do public comment. They're just emailing it in, they're doing it through. Okay, could you clarify that process, please?
Yeah. So again, while the main board meetings do have call to the public where people can come in and speak and written comment, it's the standard practice for subcommittees, given the time, the truncated nature of time for subcommittees, to allow written comment. Again, on the front page of every agenda, there is a link that says to submit written comment, click here, and it tells you where to go and the timeframes for written comment as well.
Thank you, Director Ross. I think that we're getting to the end there. So, oh, sorry, Member Krivickas. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Clark, staff. I don't know if, I'm trying to figure out how to ask this, if it's possible. First of all, I want to thank the members for an amazing discussion. And I was just laughing at how small the font kept getting too along the way. So clearly we hit a lot of really important topics, but I'm thinking about, especially, which is probably good that we're not meeting in January because you're going to have time to go through all that. If there's a way at some point to summarize that, because I think that would be helpful to distribute to stakeholders, to kind of give them a framework of, there may be specific topics they want to address or add a new one or something like that.
Vice Chair Clark, Member Krivickas. So after every board meeting, subcommittee meeting, any of those types, minutes are released and put on the board website. It's actually Shannon sitting here next to me typing furiously has been taking minutes for the meeting. So that'll be up within a couple of days and it goes through each kind of item and what was determined. We will also, once I've cleaned it up, we will update the slide deck on Simbly, so that way folks can see the feedback that was provided, the norms that were agreed upon. So that'll all be done as well. And then when we send it out to the subcommittee, I will send it cleaning up the grammar and spelling and punctuation in its raw form so that people feel like their comments were captured, but we will then summarize it to make it easier to use, because in so many things fell under one or two, specific buckets. So yeah, we will put that together.
Thank you, Member Krivickas and Director Ross. I would also like to thank staff for a wonderful first meeting and everyone for coming down here, for joining us online. Very, very pleased with how everything went and looking forward to working with everyone in the future. And now I can call for the meeting to be adjourned. Okay. So meeting adjourned at 11:19 p.m.
All right. Thank you, everybody.